I know what that answer is. Yeah.
Oh,
But does it work on the? Oh, it's working.
yeah, but it's so far away. That's
And then you can probably shift slides.
Oh,
too with that,
wow.
Can you?
yes. Okay.
So that's
Well, that's
probably
good.
better than going there.
Yeah. I have some.
yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm just gonna get a coffee and we'll start in 2 minutes.
Okay. Sounds great.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear?
Yeah, that's well. He has been here yesterday at
Bonjour tout le monde, on va commencer. We're going to start. Good morning. So welcome to the plenary talk this morning. So this morning is the first day that it's divided between CMOS and CGU. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Rachel Chang from Dalhousie University, who accepted the invitation to give this talk today. So Dr. Rachel Chang is an associate professor at the Department of Physics, Atmospheric Science at Dalhousie University, and a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Atmospheric Science. Her research uses a combination of ambient measurements, laboratory experiments, and modeling studies to explore air-sea interactions and the climate impacts on these processes through the formation of liquid fog and cloud droplets. Past studies have focused on marine and coastal atmospheres such as the North Atlantic, the Summer Arctic, the East Pacific, before starting at Dalhousie. Dr. Chang obtained degrees from the University of Toronto in engineering science, chemical engineering, and environmental chemistry, and completed a postdoctoral degree at Harvard University. So Rachel, the floor is yours.
So thank you so much. I'm really honored to have been invited to share the research that I've been doing at Dalhousie since I started in 2014. And I really am excited to share with you some of the work that we've been doing. So I was asked specifically to talk about air-sea interactions. And so the work that I'm showing you today is really specifically looking at trying to understand how the oceans and the atmosphere are connected. But I do a lot of other research, as kind of alluded to, primarily in fog and clouds more directly, but more separate than what I'm showing today. So I'm going to be trying, this talk is split into two parts. The first part, which is more extensive, really tries to understand, I'm going to have problems here, what causes summer Arctic aerosols to form and grow. And then the second part of the talk, which will be shorter, is trying to understand how seawater properties can potentially affect sea spray aerosols. So if you haven't thought about aerosol particles before, because I know that potentially this audience is quite broad, aerosol particles are suspensions of liquid or solid particles that are in the air. And these particles can range from size from 1 nanometer in diameter up to 20 microns or so. And here I'm just showing you pictures of 2 potential aerosol particle types that we might see. Sea spray aerosols on the left, which if you come from a coastal region, then you would be familiar with. And then Arctic haze, which is shown in this. I'm going to attempt to point this here. Sorry for those of you on that side. Oh, wow, that's really far. That thin black layer that's at the horizon is an example of Arctic haze, which shows up in the Arctic in the springtime. So where do particles come from in the atmosphere? Well, there are natural sources such as volcanoes, sea spray, forests, and mineral dust, for example, but there can also be anthropogenic sources such as combustion and, well, mostly combustion sources. So particles can either be directly emitted from the surface, which we call primary particles. So examples of that would be things like sea spray aerosols or volcanoes. But we also get gas phase emissions that come out of the ocean or at various surface sites. And then once those gases are in the atmosphere, they can react and condense on either existing particles, or they can nucleate together to form new particles. And then once these particles are in the air, they can directly affect the radiation budget by scattering incoming solar radiation or absorbing it. But more importantly, they can also act as the seed upon which cloud droplets form. And then clouds have a much stronger climate impact by reflecting incoming solar radiation. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this figure from the IPCC, but aerosol particles still have a large uncertainty associated with our understanding of how they affect the radiative effects. And that's primarily because of their ability to turn into clouds and our inability really to constrain how the interactions between the aerosols and clouds play out. And this large uncertainty propagates into our overall understanding of anthropogenic emissions, the radiative effects of anthropogenic emissions. So the way that these particles, changes in particle properties can affect cloud droplet properties is through their concentrations. So in a pristine environment, which is shown in the upper right figure, you can see that in a more natural state, you would have lower aerosol particle concentrations, which lead to clouds with droplet concentrations that are lower. And these clouds will then reflect solar radiation, and they can also rain out. But when the aerosol concentrations are higher, then it results in cloud droplet concentrations that are also higher. But if you have a constant liquid water content, then the cloud droplet sizes are smaller. Cloud droplet sizes are smaller, which means that if you have more droplets that are smaller, then the clouds end up being more reflective. And then because these droplets are smaller, they also are less likely to fall out as rain. And so these clouds live longer in the atmosphere. And so this overall effect of brighter clouds that live longer end up, both of these effects tend to reduce the radiative effects. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say there. And so here's the satellite image of ship tracks over the Gulf of Alaska. And you can really see this effect where the ship emissions are high in aerosol concentrations, resulting in bright clouds that are much brighter than the surrounding stratocumulus clouds that are in the background. So this is just like a real example of how you can really see that effect. In 2013, Ken Carslaw published this perspective piece about how, in reality, though, the cloud albedo at some point saturates. So if you're at a really high pollution or high aerosol concentration already in a polluted environment, then adding extra aerosols is not really going to change the reflectivity of your cloud. And so it doesn't really have a strong radiative effect. But in a clean environment, like in a pre-industrial era, for example, or in a clean environment, small changes in aerosol particle concentrations can really affect the cloud albedo. And so, this work that I'm presenting today will be really focusing on 2 types of regions where we expect that the aerosol concentrations are still low. The first is the Canadian Arctic in the summertime, and the second is in marine atmospheres in general, which you could also categorize Canadian Arctic summers as being marine in nature. I alluded to the sizes of the particles that we measure, and I'll be talking a lot. The primary measurement that I'll be showing you actually are aerosol size distributions. So I wanted to just step through the different modes that we often see, the types of particles, the sizes of the particles that we see. The smallest mode of particles tend to lie between 10 and 100 nanometers in diameter, and these we call the nucleation mode particles. These particles tend to be very short-lived, and they're basically a signature of new particle formation happening. So gas phase reactions or nucleation where gas phase molecules condense together to form new particles. And then these particles don't live very long in the atmosphere because they're so small, they can coagulate and form larger particles. And so when you see them, when we see signatures of nucleation mode particles, that means that there was recent new particle formation happening. The accumulation mode particles are the longest lived aerosols that are in the atmosphere, in the troposphere, I should say. And so these particles range in size between about 100 nanometers up to about maybe 800 nanometers in diameter. And these particles can last in the atmosphere for days into like about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the conditions. And so we call them accumulation because they accumulate in the atmosphere. So they're examples of aged aerosols that have likely been transported from further away. And then finally, there are coarse mode particles that are larger than 1 micron in diameter. And these particles tend to be formed from mechanical actions. And because they're larger and heavier, their lifetime in the atmosphere are much shorter. And so usually if you see them if you observe them in the atmosphere, that means that they formed not very far away, and that they're like a signature of a more local source. Not always, but like more than the accumulation mode particles. So basically by observing certain types, the size of the particles that we see in the atmosphere, we can infer something about the processes that led to our observing them. So just to sum up, the particles that are in the atmosphere, just to give us an idea. So there are particles that can be emitted directly from the surface, which we call primary particles. Particles can also form from the nucleation of gaseous precursors, so gases. These gases can also condense on existing particles that are in the atmosphere. Usually it's like if the air is clean enough and there's no existing surfaces for the gases to condense, then they'll start forming new particles. And then if the conditions are right, then the particles will activate into cloud droplets. And of course, the clouds are how aerosols most impact the climate. So these particles that have the ability to turn into cloud droplets we call cloud condensation nuclei. And the larger the particles are and the more hygroscopic the particles are, then the more likely they are to activate, to turn into cloud droplets at a lower supersaturation. So basically, whether a particle can turn into a cloud droplet at a given supersaturation is dependent on how large the particle is, so the larger the better, and the more how hygroscopic the particle is. So if the particle is made up of sea salt and an inorganic ion that's highly soluble, then it's more likely to turn into a droplet. But if you're an aerosol particle that's made up of an insoluble compound, like an organic, like think about oil, that's not likely to turn into a cloud. It's not as likely to turn into a cloud droplet. So in this first part of the talk, I'll be addressing 3 major questions. What causes summer Arctic aerosols to form and then grow? Can these growing particles turn into cloud droplets? And then do they affect climate? And then in the second part of the talk, I'll be talking about how does seawater, can we observe changes in aerosol properties based on changes on the seawater properties when we generate sea spray aerosols? So I don't really need to explain why the Arctic is an important place to study, but I'll just give a very brief snapshot about the temperature anomalies that have been observed in the Arctic in the northern hemisphere over the last 20 years. Which is shown in the figure on the left, and then the figure on the right shows the minimum sea ice extent. So that's in September since 1979. We see that it's been really decreasing constantly at a regular rate since then. And so the thing about the sea ice extent, it's the summer, the Arctic summer is the time when the sea ice is melting. That's when the radiation, the shortwave radiation is the strongest, and that's when the conditions are changing. I would say that the conditions are changing most rapidly and where the radiation budget is most important. And so that's one of the reasons why we focus on the summer. So as you likely know, the Arctic has a very strong seasonal cycle. This figure, strong seasonal cycle based on the sun, right? In the wintertime, there's no sun, and in the summertime, there is sun. And so this also is reflected in the aerosol mass loadings that we see. So this figure shows aerosol mass concentrations at alert for like a 20-year period. And what we see is that during the winter times, the aerosol mass concentrations are very high, but in the summertime, the aerosol mass concentration is much lower. So I'm just gonna, these up here are the winter into the spring, and the lower concentrations are during the summer times. And the reason for that is because in the winter time, when there is no sun, the air is extremely stable, and long-range transport of pollution coming from southern latitudes makes it all the way to the northern, to the Arctic. In contrast, in the summertime, there's a lot more, the air is obviously more convective, there's more wet deposition, and so the particles that were originating from the southern latitudes will wash out. And so during the summer, the particles that we do see in the Canadian Arctic, especially, are reflective of local or more regional sources. And so it's these types of particles that we're interested in their climatic impact, because they're the ones that are going to be affecting the radiative budget at those times. So the results that I'm showing you today are really, in this part of the talk, are really hinging on two large research initiatives that happened shortly around the time when I started my research position at Dal. The first was a CCAR project called NETCARE, and that's the Network on Climate and Aerosols, addressing key uncertainties in remote Canadian environments, or NETCARE. And John Abbott at University of Toronto was the PI of this project. There were lots of different components. There was modeling activities, there were aircraft observations, 2 aircraft campaigns that happened. Today I'll be focusing on results that were collected aboard the Amundsen over 2 summers, 2014 and 2016. And the list of authors or contributors for this are really just the people that I interacted with the most for the data that I'm showing you today. There were lots of other people who were involved, some of whom are in this room. So during these 2 cruises, let me just highlight in the lower right map that these 2 cruises happened at about the same time in the summer, and they covered a very similar geographic region. So, you would think that whatever was being observed in the atmosphere or like in the ocean should be very similar in terms of their properties. So that's something to think about. And then the second research initiative that I was very fortunate to be part of is the Pearl Lab, or the Pearl Research Group. So that's Polar Environmental Atmospheric Research Laboratory. And the current PI of that project, of that initiative, is Kim Strong at University of Toronto, who's been working tirelessly to try to get funding for us to continue our observations. So Pearl has been there for many, many years, like decades. I only got involved in these observations in 2015. And so the results that I'm showing are from 2015 to about now. Obviously, we don't have complete coverage because that's what happens when you have remote instruments. But it's been really helpful to have this long-term research or long-term time series. So these 2 are like really your classic examples of long-term time series. We have like basically 1 measurement of size distribution, and that's it at Pearl, but we have it over almost 10 years now. Whereas the NETCARE studies, we had lots and lots of measurements. There was it was a really intensive campaign, but it only happened over 6 weeks in 2 summers, and that's it. That's the only snapshot that we have. So by pairing these research initiatives together, we really can get a better idea of what's happening through the intensive studies, and then try to understand their more statistical representation over a longer period. So as I said, we're going to start by looking at new particle formation, which we observed at Pearl, and trying to understand where these particles are coming from. And so all of this work really started when we set up this scanning mobility particle sizer, so this aerosol size distribution measurement at Pearl in 2015. So I'm just going to take a few seconds to walk you through this figure, because we'll be looking at a lot of these contour plots of size distributions. So on the y-axis is the aerosol diameter in nanometers, and then on the x-axis is the date. And then it's colored by aerosol concentration, or normalized aerosol concentration. So the redder the color, the more particles there are. So you can see around July 2nd, I think it is there's these small particles that show up that are less than 20 nanometers in size, and then they grow to larger sizes over the next few days. And then there's an accumulation mode that kind of hangs out. And then we have these more occurrences of new particle formation, and followed by particles growing to larger sizes. And it seems to really happen throughout the summer. It's like quite frequent. What's really interesting is that at Alert, which is 500 kilometers away, we see a very similar pattern in the new particle formation and growth that's happening, which is really strange because it is really quite far and you wouldn't necessarily expect that. But it would basically suggest that new particle formation and growth happens regionally over at least Ellesmere, the northern part of Ellesmere Island. And so then the next question becomes like, is this just like a special year? It was 2016 really neat. And I'll be showing you lots of results of 2016 because it was really active, it seemed like, from the new particle formation point of view. But it turns out not every year is like that. In 2014, during that NETCARE cruise that happened in a similar region in a similar time, there was actually only maybe hints of 2 new particle formation events that happened. Yeah, and so you can see the upper figure is less bright, less red than the lower figure. And so the question is, what is the question? What is causing these particles to form and grow? Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing. Those angles are not really good for a person of my height. So if you're a marine chemist, right, you'd be like, oh, well, of course, we know it's a sulfur cycle. Everything is about, we've known about sulfur forever. And so the idea is, if you don't know about sulfur, that certain species of phytoplankton emit dimethyl sulfide, DMS, into the water. And then this dimethyl sulfide can volatilize into the atmosphere, where it can undergo atmospheric oxidation via OH, or via OH to form sulfur dioxide. Oh, thanks so much. Which can then further oxidize to form sulfuric acid. And we know that sulfuric acid is an important contributor to new particle formation and growth. And so you'd be like, well, of course, this new particle formation and growth that we're seeing is coming from DMS. End of story. But the thing is that in almost every marine environment where you see new particle formation happening via DMS, it's almost always happening above cloud, because it tends to be that the surface, the marine surface atmosphere there are too many particles there for new particle formation to happen. And it's only above cloud, where it's cleaner, that you see this new particle formation happen. And so it's actually surprising that you see this happening at the surface. Like, when I first saw this, I went through all the literature. I was like, this is of course what's happening. But it turns out nobody actually observes it at the surface. It all happens higher up in the atmosphere. And so it is true that the summertime Arctic is extremely clean. That does seem to allow the gas phase precursors to condense to form particles. But what's more interesting is that thankfully, Jim Sloan from University of Waterloo had purchased an aerosol mass spectrometer, which allowed us to measure aerosol chemical composition. And it was installed at Eureka, like in the late 2000s. And when we were there to install our instrument, we managed to get it running for 3 months, and we managed to measure the aerosol composition during 2 of these new particle formation events, new particle formation and growth events. And so here I'm showing you a picture of, a new particle formation event that happened at the beginning of August, and we had the AMS running, and you can see that the aerosol composition did have sulfate, so that's shown in red, but it was actually mostly organic, which is like green trace over there. So most of these growing particles were actually organic. So when I say organic, I mean like a carbon backbone molecule with oxygen, hydrogen, and potentially nitrogen attached to it. And so really, it seems like these particles were mostly organic. And this instrument also can measure size resolve chemical composition. And so here I'm showing the mass concentration plotted against the size, the aerosol size on the x-axis. And you can see for particles smaller than 100 nanometers that composition is mostly green, so it's mostly organic, suggesting that those growing particles are really organic in nature and almost no sulfate. All the sulfate is actually in the accumulation mode at the larger sizes. So unfortunately, the instrument is a high maintenance instrument. We only managed to get it running for 3 months, and we're never really able to get it running again after that. And so the reviewers, we submitted this, Samantha Tremblay from University of Montreal submitted this paper, and the reviewers were like, well, you should really have more measurements. And it was like, yes, we would really love to have more measurements. Unfortunately, we can't get the instrument to work anymore. So the question is really like, are all of these growth events organic in nature? Are they all being driven by organic vapors? So this is not definitive, but during the 2016 NETCARE cruise, we made CCN measurements on board. And you can actually use CCN measurements to infer the composition. As I mentioned before, whether a particle activates into a cloud droplet or not at a given supersaturation is dependent on its size and its chemical composition. And so if you know what the size of the particles are, or you have a good idea of what the size is, and if you know what the supersaturation is in your chamber, then you can infer the chemical composition, or this parameter that we call kappa, which is a hygroscopicity parameter. And the idea is that very soluble, very hygroscopic compounds like sea salt, for example, or ammonium sulfate have relatively high kappa values of 0.6 to 1, whereas organic molecules, which are non-hygroscopic, have kappa values closer to 0 or between 0 and 0.2. And so as during this cruise in 2016 in July and August, when we were seeing all these new particle formation and growth events, what we saw in the kappa values was that they were all below about 0.2, which would suggest that they were almost all organic dominated. And at the higher supersaturations, which is the purple bar, the kappa value is even lower than is lower, I should say, than the lower supersaturations. And so the higher supersaturations are sorry, I have this mixed up here. The purple bars represent the smaller particles, and so it means that the smaller particles are more organic rich than the larger particles are. Sorry, the x-axis label that I added is wrong. But basically it's saying that the particles, the growing particles, which are all relatively small being measured here, are all organic rich. So here's another piece of evidence to say that these particles, these growing particles, are organic in nature. So I think we can at least answer this first part. What is causing these newly formed particles to grow? It looks like they're organic vapors, at least over these 2 measurement years that I'm showing you. But then the next question is, where are these organic vapors coming from? Like, where are these gases coming from? We're far away from any industrial pollution sources. So, and there's no trees. That's like usually when you're in a continental environment, a terrestrial environment, you would say, oh, it's the trees emitting isoprene or monoterpenes or these gases that we know react relatively quickly to form these organic aerosol precursors. But in the ocean, what's going on here if it's not the dimethyl sulfide? So in the 2014 cruise, Emma Mungle from University of Toronto ran a chemical ionization mass spectrometer, which measured the different VOCs, so the gas phase organic compounds that were in the atmosphere. And then she used factor analysis to pull out this really interesting fingerprint of a source of aerosol that she was, or sorry, gas that she was seeing. And she called it the ocean factor because it correlated best with the DOC, so that's the dissolved organic carbon, and the chromophoric, dissolved organic matter that was in the water, which is shown in panel C here in the red and the yellow. And interestingly, this ocean factor did not correlate with isoprene measurements, which she also measured from the mass spectrometer, and it also didn't correlate with isoprene at all. So these are both things that we know from, that we knew, or we thought we knew, would form particles, but actually they did not at all seem to correlate with this ocean factor. So they hypothesized that the ocean surface was the one that's generating these volatile organic compounds, either through radiation or irradiation, so sunlight shining on the water, and then photooxidizing or photosensitizing, like kicking off reactions, chemical reactions that were happening, which would then cause the gases to go into the atmosphere, or potentially from ozone or OH, so ozone oxidation of the surface. So that would be like a surface reaction in the surface microlayer. So it could be through ozone or OH radicals. And so as part of the 2016 cruise, we collected liters of surface microlayer samples throughout the Arctic, as well as bulk water samples. Or well, I call it bulk, but it's really surface. For you, if you're an oceanographer, then it's not bulk, it's just the surface. And then she put it, Stephanie Schneider, from John's group at University of Toronto, put this water samples in a flow tube and then exposed the water samples to ozone and then measured the chemicals that were coming off, like the volatile organic compounds that were coming out of the tube when they were being exposed to ozone. And then she did another set of experiments where she shone light on it. So no ozone, just shining light. And then what she saw was the amount of VOCs, the amount of gas phase organic compounds that were coming off the water did increase with both irradiation experiments and in the ozone experiments. And it increased linearly with the total organic carbon in the water content. So now we have proof that there is a mechanism that would release organic compounds from the water surface to the atmosphere. And whether that's actually happening in our case, we don't know, but at least there's one way that we could get this, or some ways that we can explain this. So I think we can say that, one way that we can be getting these organic vapors is from the ocean surface. So, okay, now we know that we can there are gases that are coming from the water, and then or from the ocean surface, and they oxidize and form new particles. But we know that these particles are mostly organic and they don't grow very large. Do they actually grow large enough that they can turn into cloud droplets? Can they actually activate a CCN? Because if they don't, then it doesn't matter in terms of from a climate point of view. So as part of the 2016 cruise, I mentioned we brought a CCN counter on board. And so here I'm zooming in on like one period of the study where you can see a new particle formation and growth event happening at the start of this period. And then the black points here show the mode diameter. So that's just the diameter with the highest concentration, just so you can see the particles growing in size throughout the study. And then in this next panel, what I'm showing you are the CCN concentrations at the different supersaturations, color-coded. And then the black points are the total concentration. And so if you look at this first, I know there's like lots and lots of data, but let's just break it down into this first part here. In the first part of this period, we see that the total concentration in black dots on the lower panel is quite high. It's like more than 1,000, which in the Canadian Arctic is actually very high in concentration. In this room, it's probably like more than 1,000, but here in Baffin Bay, it's like a very high concentration. But you'll notice that the CCN concentrations are very low. Like there's almost like very few of them are activating. And if you look at the size distribution up top, you can see why that is. Most of the particles are smaller than 40 nanometers still, and so they're too small to activate. And that's why we're not seeing any response in the CCN concentrations, even though the total concentrations exceed 1,000. And then in this next period here, the particles have grown larger than 40 nanometers, and the CCN concentrations have started to respond to this increase in aerosol concentration. And then, so it really looks like the particles need to be larger than 40 nanometers before we can observe them activating at any of the supersaturation our chamber was at. And so this process repeats when the particles are larger. It seems like the CCN concentrations increase, but when the particles are too small, then they don't activate. And so to get a sense of how new particle formation events are contributing to the CCN concentrations overall, I divided the study into 3 periods or 3 types of times. The first was background times, when we were not observing any CCN or not observing any new particle formation or growth. That's when the background concentrations, the total concentrations were less than 500 particles per cubic centimeter. And then I looked at times when the particle concentrations were higher than 500 particles per cubic centimeter and the mode diameter was less than 100 nanometers. So this was an indication of when we were seeing new particle formation or growth. And then I further zoomed in to times when we knew it looked like specifically that the CCN counter, like that the particles were actually activating a CCN. So that's when the diameters were between 40 and 100 nanometers. And then I took the mean at each of the supersaturations and subtracted the background from them. And so if we look at all the times when the particles we were in a new particle formation or growth time and subtracted the background from it, we're seeing an increase. So these basically is saying that these new particle formation and growth events are contributing between 13 and 274 particles per cubic centimeter, which is equivalent to 22 or 167 to 167% increase in the total CCN concentrations. And if we focus it to just the growth times, that value is even higher. So basically what I'm trying to convey here is that these new particle formation and growth events really do contribute to an increase in CCN concentrations, even at supersaturations as low as 0.26%, which is a totally environmentally relevant supersaturation. So, because we think that clouds can form at between 0.2 and 0.3. And so even at those, environmentally relevant supersaturations, we're increasing the CCN concentrations by 22%, sorry. So to answer this question now, can these small organic particles actually activate into droplets? The answer is yes. And so then what are those radiative impacts? So Betty Croft, who is at Dalhousie, working in my department, uses this global chemical transport model called GeosChem, and she uses this variation of it that has an aerosol microphysics package, so where she can actually predict what the chemical composition is at different sizes, and it has all the aerosol microphysics incorporated into it. So she modified the model for the summer of 2016 to basically amp up the new particle formation and the gases that were present, basically coming from the ocean, to try to incorporate all these processes. And so this figure on the right shows the mass fraction attributed to different parts of the chemical composition. And so she was able to basically simulate, at least to a certain degree, how, a large organic aerosol mass fraction into the aerosols at small sizes between 10 and 100 nanometers. But in her model, she still has to rely heavily on sulfate to kick off that new particle formation. But we don't really observe that sulfate, so it's something that we're still trying to figure out. But Nevertheless, she was able to get fairly good agreement, or I guess comparisons between the model and the observations. And then so she was able to calculate what the radiative effects of the addition of these organic gases into the atmosphere would be. So the direct radiative effects of having these particles, so their direct scattering of radiation is relatively low, but that's not that surprising. But their contribution to cloud droplet formation is, it is a significant amount. It's negative 0.4 watts per meter squared, which is, I guess, not an insignificant amount, is what I would say. So I've really focused on 2014, 2016, these 2 years, but how prevalent are these types of events? So thankfully, we've had a pretty good record of at least particle size distributions at Pearl. And so Philippe Gauvin-Bourdon, who's a PhD student working with me right now, did a cluster analysis on the size distributions that we've measured over the last 10 years. And basically, he clustered the clusters that we retrieved, I guess, from this record, fell into, I've categorized them into 3 categories related to the paper, the CCN measurements I was showing earlier. So there's these small particles that are indicative of new particle formation. And then this mode in the middle, the growth particles, which have a mode diameter between 40 and 100 nanometers, and then background particles. And then we looked at what their seasonal, or like their monthly frequencies of each of these clusters were. So in the summertime, between June, July and August, the new particle formation clusters account for approximately 22% of the time, whereas the purple cluster, so that's the potentially CCN active cluster, is approximately 15% of the time is what we're seeing. So it does look like over the summers, at least at Pearl, approximately 40% of the time is being influenced by these new particle formation events, new particle formation and growth, likely originating from these organic vapors coming from the ocean. So just to summarize, we see summer growth, or the summer aerosol formation and growth in the Canadian Arctic is being driven by organic vapors that we think are originating from the ocean surface. These growing particles can activate into cloud droplets at an environmentally relevant supersaturation of 0.26%, and they do increase the CCN concentrations by 22%, and that there's a the radiative effect of these types of particles is on the order of negative 0.4 watts per meter squared. So that's the end of the first part. This is really like a summary, as I mentioned, of many years of work contributed by many people. And so in the second part of the talk, which will be rather short, I'm just going to focus on this one study that we were working on last year. And that's trying to understand if seasonal variations in seawater properties can result in observed differences in the sea spray aerosol production. So the reason why we're interested in sea spray aerosols is because there's a large uncertainty in terms of understanding what the total mass flux is from the ocean into the atmosphere. It ranges at least over an order of magnitude, and different models have much larger ranges than this. And these large uncertainties propagate into large uncertainties in the CCN concentrations, which then lead to large uncertainties or uncertainties in the radiative forcing. So the way that sea spray aerosols form is through the entrainment of air through wave action. So the wave action causes air to be entrained into the water, and as the bubbles rise to the surface, they pop. And so there's 2 mechanisms that we think sea spray aerosols are formed. The first is through film drops, which forms when there's larger bubbles in the that burst at the surface. And when these large bubbles burst, the film emits lots of small particles. And because it's the film that's erupting, then we think that these particles are more organic rich than the surface water is. And then in contrast, there's also jet drops that form, which form from smaller bubbles. When these small bubbles burst, then the cavity collapses on itself and it ejects a few large particles into the air. And so these particles are more likely to be similar to sea salt, so soluble and like sea salt, basically. So you would think that because sea spray the formation of sea spray aerosols is so dependent of whatever's happening at the surface that it should really depend on the surface water properties, whether it's the chemistry or the chemistry, the biology, or the physics, the physical properties of the water. But it's actually hard to look at, or very few, like basically it's very hard to really determine that. Past studies have used mesocosm and microcosm experiments in tanks or in the lab where they really ramp up the biological activity that cause like drastic changes in the water chemistry and the water biology. And then they see changes in the particles that are being emitted. But are these biological activity levels realistic of the real environment? Like would that actually propagate to real changes in the atmosphere if this were to happen? So it's not really necessarily relevant. Another way that people try to study this is on ship cruises, where they go to different places, different water masses, take water from the ocean, and then generate particles artificially on the ship, or they generate them over the side of the ship and then try to see differences. But that's also tricky because you really get a snapshot in time. And even if you were to go back, you're seeing different water masses with different biology and chemistry. And so it's really hard to attribute differences in what you're seeing to the water properties itself. So the question is, are realistic changes in or environmental changes in the water properties that you would expect in reality, do they actually cause changes in the aerosol properties? So to try to address this question, to try to fill in this gap, a very eager master's student in my group, Dalhousie, conducted this set of experiments where we took water from the Bedford Basin over 9 months between March and November 2024. Those are the results I'm showing you today. We have a slightly longer record now, but this is what I'm showing. And we got water twice a month and then did experiments with them. So I'll just point out, if you've never been to Halifax because you missed CMOS 2018, I think it was, then the red dot is sort of the water body that's shown in the northern part is the Bedford Basin, and the red dot is where our sampling took place, and it coincides with the deepest part of the basin, which is shown in the bathymetry figure on the top right. So I mentioned that we collected water, and then basically, well, we is not right. I did not collect the water, but Jack collected the water twice a month and then put it into this intermittent plunging sheet tank that we have in our lab, where it's obviously not a real wave, but it has at least a controlled. We have this repetitive, or like repeatable experiment. Conditions where we're generating these waves. And so basically the only thing that changes from month to month, from sample to sample, is the water that's inside the tank. So any changes that we see in the aerosol properties, we're attributing to the changes in water properties. And so we sampled the air that was coming out of this tank for their size. And so that's what I'll be showing you today, the aerosol size distributions for large particles between 0.5 and 5 microns, and then also the smaller sizes between 10 nanometers and 500 nanometers. And then because we didn't, other people are making measurements of the surface water chemistry, but I don't think they've completed them and didn't share them with us yet. So we made surface tension measurements of the bulk water to get some idea of how the composition in the water was changing. So it's just like a very rough cut of trying to understand what's happening. So for most of this period, this is what the aerosol size distribution looked like. You can see that there's two modes, the accumulation mode and the coarse mode, which we roughly split at 500 nanometers. It's slightly operational because of our instruments. And this distribution actually recurred throughout the study. But there are three notable times when this wasn't the case. The first is what we attributed at first to the spring bloom, which happened in May. This was only two of our studies. Two of our samples, but what you see is that the accumulation mode particles became more numerous and slightly larger. And then we went back, the size distribution went back to that background state. But then in July to August, this distribution changed again, and we saw more smaller particles, occurring. And then in the fall, when you would have thought the fall bloom should have happened, the distribution changed again, and in a very surprising way, in that the coarse mode particles, the largest particles, seem to decrease they decreased in concentration. And so we were trying to understand. So we're definitely seeing seasonal differences in the sea spray aerosol that we generated. So then the question is, what is driving this? Is there some seasonality to the water properties that can explain this? We're kind of short in time, so I'm going to skip this figure. We were trying to use a surface tension to try to see something about the composition of the water, and it does seem to change on a seasonal basis, but not really enough to understand what we're doing. So instead, I'm going to skip to the water chemistry, or at least the indicators for biological productivity for this period. So we also, like I said, we don't have data for our measurement period, but apparently the cycle is pretty repeatable within the basin. So this is from an earlier year. So the dissolved oxygen is shown in blue, and then I'll just focus on the chlorophyll A, which is shown in green. And then overlaying this, I'm showing the 3 periods when we saw changes in our aerosol size distribution. So spring, summer, and fall. And I don't know, the story is a little bit odd. I mean, the most striking part of this is that in the fall, during the fall bloom, when the chlorophyll A concentrations are high, that's when we really see a difference in the size distribution. But the spring and the fall, or sorry, the spring and the summer are less clear. There are some peaks in the dissolved oxygen, but like it's not, the story is definitely not as clear. So we think what's the other part of the story is trying to understand the vertical mixing in the basin. So it seems like the times when we see higher sea spray aerosol concentrations coincide with the spring bloom. So sorry, I should say this is the temperature, the vertical temperature profiles is what I would call it of the Bedford Basin over a July to July period, also a repeatable cycle within the basin. The spring blooms seem to have, our change in the spring aerosol size distribution coincided with when we got overturning in the basin in the springtime, which is the blue box on the right. And then the summertime, when we had also high sea spray aerosols, higher concentrations of aerosols, seemed to coincide with a time when the basin was extremely vertically stratified. And so it seems like whatever was happening at the surface was really concentrated because it couldn't mix further down. But what was interesting is that in the fall period, that also coincided with another period of overturning when the surface water was being mixed lower. What's also interesting is it turns out we didn't realize this until much later in our study, but the biological oceanographers led by Julie Laroche at Dalhousie had also done this biology categorization in the ocean. And the spring bloom is more variable in terms of the types of taxa that dominate, but the fall bloom always seems to have cyanobacteria, which is this red bar. This is really beyond my expertise, but it always has cyanobacteria present in the fall. And it has actually been observed in a previous study that the presence of cyanobacteria can suppress sea spray aerosol production. And so at least this is consistent with what we're seeing. This picture here just shows like the water sample from one of those fall samples. So it does look like perhaps this presence of the cyanobacteria is contributing to the suppression of coarse mode particles being formed. So this is still a work in progress, not nearly as mature as my earlier study, but what we found is that the natural seasonal variation in surface seawater does seem to result in observable changes in the sea spray aerosol concentration and distributions, with higher concentrations in the spring and the summer and lower concentrations in the fall. And that the ocean properties that seem to be accounting for these differences is a mixture between physical properties like temperature as well as biology. So just to summarize, just to wrap up, what causes summer Arctic aerosols to form and grow? Organic vapors coming from the ocean waters. These particles can turn into droplets and they can affect the radiative budget. And also seawater properties can affect mostly realistic, if you believe that the Bedford Basin is realistic, can affect sea spray aerosol production. So with that, I'd really like to thank you for your time and your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I was first. So Rachel, great talk. My question is, so if the chemistry is there, the source is there, the vertical, profile of supersaturation or temperature is kind of an average there. Why it's not more common, like the process of NPF?
Sorry, which process? The new particle formation
Yeah.
and growth? Why is it more common?
Why it's not more why it's not continuously happening, you know?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think one thing is that once you start forming the particles, then then there's a surface for the gases to condense on, and so then it leads to growth instead of new particles forming, but then at some point it rains. Like basically, you get clouds, you get scavenging, and it cleans the air again, and then that's when you can kickstart another new particle formation event.
So how often do you observe it actually?
The new particle formation
Yeah.
and growth. So from the time series, like the Pearl data, it looks like approximately 37% of the time in the summer, we see these types of signatures of new particle formation and growth. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I can read it. Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned that the motivation for this work is to study non-polluted regions where aerosols can really affect clouds. Is the Bedford Basin representative of a non-polluted marine region, given that's surrounded by city, or does that not really matter for your analysis? So I would say in this case, we're really just trying to understand, thanks Julie, and thanks for the question. So in this case, we're really just trying to understand how sea spray aerosols are forming. And so it could be applied, hopefully, to other parts of the ocean where it's cleaner in the atmosphere.
Hi. Oh, sorry. You want to go ahead? Okay. Oceanographer here, so correct all my misconceptions here. But
no, you'll be correcting my misconceptions, I think.
Humidity
in
the air, or the amount of water in the air, decreases with temperature, and in fact, at -40, there's none. In the Arctic, there's going to be more open ice, and the temperatures are rising. So I'm just wondering whether you're looking at temperature at all in what's happening, and that's going to help you with predicting what might happen in the future.
So in this set of studies, I haven't actually looked at I haven't really looked at the meteorology. I've just been looking at the particles and whether they form or not, and whether the conditions are there for clouds to form, as opposed to actually looking at whether the clouds form. That's like then you get to go into cloud modeling, which I'm not into yet. But that's an absolutely important point, which I forgot to emphasize, is like, we're trying to understand what's happening now in our current conditions, but as the climate is changing, as sea ice coverage reduces and we have more open waters, more water vapor in the atmosphere, potentially more shipping in the Arctic, are all of these regimes going to change? Are we not going to have less, are we going to have less new particle formation because it's dirtier? Possibly there's more water vapor, which will lead to more cloudiness, which will change the frequency of these types of events. So there's all sorts of questions that I'm only barely hinting at here.
Thank you.
But thank you for pointing them out.
So we have another question on
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe that's easier.
Yeah. Okay. This one. Okay.
Michael Morris.
Oh, that was the same one.
You mentioned that the motivation of this work.
Yeah, I already read this one.
Oh no, you read the other one. Was it this one you read?
Oh no, this one. Are aerosols meteors? WMO Cloud Atlas defines hydrometeors, lithometeors, photometeors, and electrometeors. Meteors are so non-shooting star rock type. Examples are rainbows, lightning, hail, water spouts, aurora, all involving visible moving particles of matter. I think generally we don't consider aerosols as a meteor. At least that's my reading, but I am not trained in meteorology, so WMO doesn't mean so much to me. To me, an aerosol is anything that's suspended in atmosphere. I would say, on the other hand, that droplets, cloud droplets, are examples of aerosols because they're suspended. But I guess I don't actually know what the actual definition is. But if somebody here knows, then they can fill in. Maybe Julie, do you know?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting talk. I have a question about the relation between increased aerosol emissions and radiative cooling. So I think you're assuming there's a direct relationship between more aerosols, more clouds, higher albedo, more cooling. I was at a talk last year at NETCARE about the effect of reduction in sulfur in ship fuel and the clouds, the cloud tracks. And what I took away from that is it's complicated, because they were saying in some cases it can increase cloud formation and cooling. In other cases, it has the opposite effect, and it just seemed very subtle. And so I wonder if there's the same effect here.
Yeah, I've seen talks like this about how like this reduction in sulfur is actually very hard to capture in terms of the radiative effects, even though like it's very visible. Like this is the, I mean, I saw a talk maybe by the same person as you. I think it's Michael Diamond. Yeah, and he was like, you can see it, right? It's very visible. But then when you try to quantify it through satellite quantitatively, it's actually very challenging. And I think that's just, you know, part of our large uncertainties with our aerosol cloud interactions. So I think that's where I would leave it at. Yeah.
We have another question.
Oh, okay. This is working out perfectly.
Yeah. This one from Alex.
Could you comment of ice nucleating properties of newly formed particles? So I would say in this case that they're, in terms of these small particles that we're observing, I would guess that they're not very ice active, only because I guess what we traditionally think of as ice nucleating particles, as Alexi obviously knows, we think of like mineral dust and things that have crystal structures that are similar to that of ice, or at least more of a crystalline structure, whereas these newly formed particles we think are organic in nature, spherical, amorphous, not crystalline. So I would expect that they're not very ice nucleating, ice active. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. Early on, you showed a plot from ALERT that showed the nitrates and sulfates. And it kind of looked like over time the nitrates were decreasing and the sulfates were increasing. I was wondering if that's like tied to increased pollution or like decreased sea ice, or if you know the cause for that.
Yeah, so I mean, that's from a very early part of the, like, you know, that time series ended, I think, in 2002. So it's been some time, and it has, those mass loadings overall have been changing, usually decreasing. But also it has to do with the different source strengths, like different parts of the southern latitudes affect they're transported differently into the Arctic. And so although maybe North American pollution has been, or I guess European pollution has been decreasing, but other parts of the world have been increasing. And so it's like a balance between all of those.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Oh.
Hi there, just one more question.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you know what are the organic vapor precursors to these aerosols, and are they measurable gases at measurable concentrations for in situ measurements? Thanks.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Like, what are the actual gases? So Emma Mungel's paper, where they actually measured these gas phase compounds, did quantify them, or at least some of them, and did identify them. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but they tend to be oxygenated volatile organic compounds. So they're heavier, they're more oxygenated, they're less volatile basically than your average VOC. So yes, they can be measured, and people do measure them, but not me. Okay. Well, thanks very much for everybody, and coffee break.
Thank you again, Rachel. And like she said, it's coffee break. And the next session starts at 10:30. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for moderating. Yeah.